We've been taking a look today at the power of invitation. What is it when someone says, would you come with me? Would you come and see the power and influence that has as a draw for someone? It got me to an opera, and it got people like Simon Peter and Nathaniel to Jesus. It gets a lot of people to Jesus when someone says, would you come and see? We looked at the cases of Andrew and of Philip. But before we leave today, I want us to look at the case of another lady whose name we don't even know. She was a Samaritan woman, and she just happened to be someone that Jesus met one day when he's sitting by a well. She comes along, and if you remember the story from John chapter 4, Jesus asks her for a drink. And she's kind of surprised, because that was not a custom for a Jew to have made a request of a Samaritan. If you remember the history and the cultural context of Jesus' time, Jews and Samaritans hated each other. They didn't talk to each other. They certainly didn't help each other or request help from each other. And yet Jesus reaches out to her and he says, would you give me a drink? And she does. And that starts a conversation that in itself is a pretty powerful story. But today I want to draw your attention not so much to the specifics of that conversation that Jesus has, but rather to what happens, what the woman does as a response to the conversation that she and Jesus have. Because pretty soon the disciples come along. They've been in town grabbing some food for lunch, and they return. And what the woman does upon their return is something that reveals the power of invitation. We read it in John chapter 4, beginning at verse 28. Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? They came out of the town and they made their way toward him. Here's a woman who thinks she may be onto something about this guy named Jesus, but she's not quite sure. You know, she's even asking the question, could he be the Christ? But nonetheless, she goes back into town and she begins to invite people to come out and meet Jesus as well. Now, a further curiosity in this story is the idea that this is a woman probably that didn't have the best of reputations. Her conversation with Jesus reveals that actually she's had several husbands. She hasn't been able to stay married, and she's actually living with a man right now who's not her husband, in violation of God's will. And yet she recognizes something in Jesus, and in spite of the potential reputation that she had in her town, nonetheless she runs back. She's had such a powerful encounter with Jesus that she comes back and she says, come and meet this man. Could this be the one we've been waiting for? I want to draw your attention as the story continues, what results from that woman's invitation. For in verse 39, we read that many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. And as we read on, we find out that the further result of all of this is that they want more. They want more of Jesus. Verse 40, so when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them. And he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. A Samaritan woman with a questionable reputation in her town, who has a powerful encounter with Jesus, runs to people and says, come and see. Come and meet this man. And many become believers in him, become his followers. And then they want him to hang around for a while and to continue to teach them and to help them to understand God's ways. Another scenario in which we see the power of that personal invitation. Now, let me make just 3 quick observations about all 3 of these scenarios of invitation. The first one is that they all spring from a meaningful encounter with Jesus. Now, last week we talked about the fact that this has to be real for us if it's going to be contagious, if it's going to be something that other people can get. You can't give what you don't got. And in all 3 of these, whether it's the case of Andrew, who spends the afternoon and evening with Jesus, or the case of Philip, who has this powerful encounter with Jesus, or the woman at the well, who recognizes something significant in Jesus. Maybe she's not completely sure about what it is, but nonetheless, she's had an encounter that propels her to want to invite others to come and see. Now, in the second observation I would make is simply the idea that none of the people in these encounters is a biblical scholar, is someone who's been a follower of Jesus for a long time, or someone that has it all figured out. All three of these people have this encounter with Jesus, but they're not the experts, they're not the mature ones. They've simply had an encounter with Jesus that propels them to invite others to come and see. I think sometimes some of us are hesitant to extend that invitation because we think, I'm not a biblical scholar. I can't explain all of the nuances of meaning in the Hebrew and the Greek. Or I'm not a systematic theologian. I can't explain to someone the distinctions between pre- and post-lapsarian double predestination. And we maybe think of ourselves as someone new to the faith, and we don't believe that because we're not any of those things that anybody would accept our invitation or would come along because of that. But in all three of these encounters, we're dealing with someone who's just a pretty typical normal Joe, just somebody who had a meaningful encounter with Jesus and wants to invite someone else to experience that as well. You don't have to be the mature believer that has an answer for everything. Simply someone who has seen something in their experience of Jesus that they want to invite someone else to come along and experience. Now, a third observation I would make in all three of these scenarios is that all three of these people take some degree of risk. Andrew, in inviting Peter to come to Jesus, makes the risk of the declaration that we found the Messiah, the one we've been looking for. Now, maybe that one is not so great, but you've got a Philip who goes to a Nathanael who's skeptical. How can anything good come out of Nazareth? Surely this can't be the Messiah. Nonetheless says, well, come and see. And then you've got a Samaritan woman, someone who is probably looked down upon by many folks in the town, who invites the people of the town nonetheless to come and meet this man who told her everything that she did. All three of those invited some risk of rejection, someone mocking the claims that they're making about Jesus, but invitation contains an element of risk. And yet in all three cases, people come to know Jesus and become followers of Jesus, become believers in Jesus because someone says, come and see. How about you? Are you an inviter? Have you said to some of those people that you know, why don't you come and see? Come and see what we're learning about Jesus or what we're experiencing of Jesus in what we're doing here at Vibe, or in a Bible study that I'm having, or in our small group, or whatever the case may be. Are we a people who are saying to others, come and see? There's some risks involved, but they're not so great. But when we do, inevitably, some people find that as the moment in which they become a follower of Jesus. Are you willing to say to others, come and see? Mark Middleberg tells of a time a few years back when a guy's friends threw a birthday party for him. There were about 30 people at this party, including one guy in the group that he had never seen before. Someone he had never met, somebody he didn't know. And even later in the course of this party, this stranger pulls out a violin and plays along with the happy birthday song as the group of friends sing for him. We thought it's a nice gesture, but he was just a little curious about who this guy was. Finally, he asked someone who was able to fill him in. The violinist, the stranger, he had never met, who was at his birthday party, was just a musician who was making his way across the country alone. He'd travel for a while, he'd sit and play, whatever the case may be, make a little money, and then continue on. His wife, Nancy, had met him at the train station and had simply invited him to Mark's birthday party, just in case, at the party, he might meet some contagious Christians who might be the ones in whom he saw a glimpse of what it meant to follow Jesus. And maybe that moment would be the one that invites this man into a relationship with Jesus as well. Now that's some pretty radical inviting, but there's a pretty powerful influence in the personal invitation that says to someone, come and see. It was enough to get me as a junior in high school to go sit through a night of opera music. Imagine what your invitation to someone might be if you invite them to come and somehow get to know Jesus.